So today I'm going to go over an incredibly strong void-focused prismatic warlock build. And I had some criteria when putting this build together. First off, no exotic class item. The dual destiny mission is pretty hard, especially if you're a solo player trying to do it through LFG. So we're using a normal exotic armor piece. Second, I wanted to be very good for high-end content like GM Nightfalls. That means you'll have many options to counter all champions, and our armor mods are going to be a bit more focused on that high tier content. Third, I want the build to be pretty simple to play. There's no super intricate buffs or anything you need to keep up. It's pretty simple. You use your abilities how you would use them and you just shoot things. There's no added layers on top of that. And fourth, I want the build to be able to put out really good boss damage in a very simple way. And I think we hit all of this criteria. So starting off, we have our exotic armor piece, Nezarec Sin, incredibly simple exotic armor piece. Void damage kills increase your ability energy recharge rate. So getting any void kills through your weapons or through your abilities gives you 2.5 seconds of a buff that gives you 300% increase regenerate for your melee and your grenade, and 200% increase regenerate for your class ability and your super. And every time you get a kill, you increase the duration of this buff. So you don't have to stack it up or do anything else like that. You just get a kill, you get some duration of this buff, you get more kills, it increases the duration. Super simple, easily one of the most simple exotic armor pieces. But that brings us to our ability choices. Now we're going to be using Nova Bomb. This is an incredibly high damaging super. It's fire and forget, so it's not a roaming super, so you get back to using all of your normal weapons. And it's a light super, which we're going to have massively increased damage with. Then for a class ability, we're going to be using Phoenix Dive. The main reason is because it's the lowest cooldown. It's going to proc our other effects, specifically Hellion. And for our melee ability, we're going to default to Arcane Needle. This is just incredibly strong. And then for our melee, we're going to default to Arcane Needle. It's an incredibly strong melee, has 3 charges that all refresh when you use Transcendence. It unravels enemies, and it does dark damage to help fill up our Transcendence dark meter much more quickly. Now, depending on what high tier content you're doing, you may want to switch out to Chain Lightning, but we'll go over that when we go over how to counter champions. Then the grenade we're going to be using is Vortex Grenade. We want this for Nezarec Sin, and it's going to proc a ton of additional effects. Then for our aspects, Feed the Void. Getting any kill with an ability gives us Devour, and Devour's effects are increased, so it pretty much full heals us anytime we get a kill and gives us a lot of grenade energy back. Then we have Hellion, which when you use our class ability, we summon a Solar Mortar. It lobs these high damaging attacks at enemies in front of us, scorches them, and can ignite them. Just does a massive amount of damage. Is also counted as an ability, so it'll proc Devour as well. Then for our fragments, we're going to be using Facet of Courage. Your light abilities deal increased damage to targets afflicted with a darkness debuff. Now, as a basis for this build, we're going to be using Arcane Needle, so that's a main way you apply this. If you're doing higher tier content and you're using Chain Lightning, you can switch this out for pretty much anything you want. I would normally just default to something like Facet of Hope if I'm using Chain Lightning, but if you're using Arcane Needle, this is going to give you a 10% increased damage to all of your light abilities, and we're using a light super and a grenade, so it's going to do massively increased damage through that. Then we're going to be using Facet of Balance. Rapidly defeating targets with light damage grants melee energy, and rapidly defeating targets with darkness damage grants grenade energy. And you're going to be getting both of those pretty often. Then we're using Facet of Bravery. Defeating targets with grenades grants volatile rounds to your void weapons, which we're going to be using as our main weapon. And then defeating targets with a powered melee grants you unraveling rounds for your strand weapon, which we're also going to be using. So we'll be using both parts of this. Both parts are very strong. Then we're going to be using Facet of Sacrifice. When you have a light buff, which we'll pretty much always have, ability Final Blows grant darkness Transcendence energy. This is a way to help us build up our darkness more quickly because we're primarily doing light damage. And then finally, Facet of Dominance. Your void grenades weaken, which is the main thing we're going to be using here. So both our Transcendence and our Vortex Grenade weaken now, which is a 15% damage increase, but that's also going to be increased with another one of our effects. And then that brings us to our artifact mods. The first row you can use whatever you want, but I am using a sidearm, so counter unstoppable, and a pulse rifle to counter barrier. Then in the second row, overcharge armory. Weapons with these origin traits, specifically dealer's choice, are always overcharged when that modifier is active. Then we have winning hand. When using weapons with the dealer's choice origin trait, combatant precision final blows or rapidly defeating targets creates a solar explosion, and one of our main weapons is going to be a dealer's choice weapon. Then we have press the advantage. Breaking a combatant's shield grants increased weapon stability, handling, healing and reload speed. Then Threaded Blast, destroying a tangle with a strand weapon, creates a larger and more damaging explosion. And we are going to be using a strand weapon. We are going to be able to create tangles, and with Threaded Blast, your tangles basically become mini nukes. Then we're going to be using Counter Energy. When you or a member of your fire team stun a champion, you gain energy for your least charge ability. Going to be incredibly strong for high-end content. Then Void Hegemony. When we defeat a weakened target, we'll get a small Void Overshield. Both of our grenades are going to weaken, so we'll be getting a bunch of Void Overshields. Then Radiant Orbs. When we pick up an Orb of Power, we become Radiant. Main way we're going to keep that up. And then in the final row, we have Expanding Abyss. Void sources deal increased damage to weakened targets. Now this increases our weakened effect from taking 15% increased damage to 25%. So this is a massive damage increase for all of our Void weapons and abilities. Then Shield Crush. When you have Woven Mail Frost Armor or Void Overshield, your melee recharges quicker. We'll have our Overshield up a good amount of the time. And then while you're amplified to Radiant, your grenade recharges faster, and we'll have Radiant a lot of the time as well. And the stats you're going to want to go for is always 100 resilience. Then I'm going for Discipline next. Our Void Grenade is just so incredibly strong. And then after that, you can go whatever you want. You can go Recovery if you want that increased health regen and to reduce the cooldown of your class ability, or you can go Strength to reduce the cooldown of your melee. Either or isn't going to really change up the build that much. But then we have our armor mod. Starting with our helm, we're going to be using Harmonic Cipher. So Rapid Void Final Blows give us Orbs of Power. Special Ammo Finder, our other weapon's going to be a special weapon. And then Ashes to Assets to get bonus super energy on our grenade kills. Then for our gauntlets, we're going to be using Firepower, so your grenade final blows create Orbs of Power. We're going to be using Momentum Transfer, so causing damage with a grenade reduces your melee. And then Impact Induction, causing damage with your melee reduces your grenade. So when we use our abilities, it gives us some of our other abilities back just to be able to use them all more frequently. Then on our chest armor, we're just going to be using any damage reduction that's good for the content you're doing. So just change this up to whatever resistance mod you currently need for that content. Then for our leg armor, we're going to be using 3 Void Weapon Surge mods. So we pick up an Orb of Power, we get 1 armor charge. Now our Void weapons are doing massively increased damage. Armor charges are going to be lasting 10 seconds, and we're going to create a good amount of Orbs of Power, so you always have this up. Just makes us deal a lot more damage with 2 of the main weapons I'm using. Then finally, for our class item, we're using Distribution, reduces all ability cooldowns when using your class ability near targets. Our class ability has a low cooldown anyway. Reaper, shortly after using your class ability, your next weapon final blow creates another Orb of Power, just more ways to create Orbs of Power. And then Bomber, reduces grenade cooldown when using your class ability. So just again, synergizing to get all of our abilities back much more quickly. Now this brings us to our weapons. Now the main Void weapon I'm going to be using is Graviton Lance. This is just so incredibly strong. Pulse Rifles are very good right now. Pulse Rifles also have anti-barrier for your artifact mods. So Graviton Lance is just absurdly strong in this build right now. Then we're also going to be using the Call Sidearm. This is because this weapon is just ridiculously strong, easily one of the strongest legendary weapons in the game right now, and it's dark damage, so it helps fill our darkness meter. This is the main way we fill our dark meter. Using these 2 weapons as our main weapons is just ridiculously strong. And then for my heavy, I'm currently using Edge Transit from Onslaught. Now this weapon is one of the highest damage heavy weapons, specifically when going against bosses, and I got a good roll, Envious Assassin, Explosive Light. Now a good thing about this is we're going to be dealing increased damage. Our weaken is going to be 25% with our Void abilities and weapons, so now Edge Transit getting a 25% buff, Graviton Lance getting a 25% buff against anything that was hit by our grenade. So against a boss, this is absurdly strong, going to do a ridiculous amount of damage. Now if you're damaging a boss, how you're going to go about it is you're going to throw your grenade, so it weakens, you're going to hit them with your melee ability, that's going to put a darkness debuff on them, you're going to Nova Bomb, and your Nova Bomb is going to get the increased damage from Facet of Courage. Your grenade is also going to be getting that 10% damage increase. Then they're both going to be getting the 25% damage increase from weaken that is applied from our grenade. So both our Nova Bomb and our Vortex Grenade going to be dealing 35% increased damage to the target. Then we're going to Edge Transit spam, which is going to be getting a 25% increase to that target. And Edge Transit has some of the highest damage for any heavy weapon. So you're going to be doing a ridiculous amount of boss damage. And that brings us to countering champion enemies, because with the current setup I have, it's pretty easy for 2 of the champions. We have a Pulse Rifle, counters barrier. We have a Sidearm, counters unstoppable. Super easy, but then Overload, we kind of have an issue with. We can use Suppression, which we get from our Transcendence Grenade specifically, so you can hold Transcendence if you know where Overload champions are going to be. But besides that, we really don't have a good way to counter Overload, but you can change up some of the build to counter them. First off, you can use Chain Lightning. So you go melee someone with Chain chain lightning, and then you shoot them, and if that jolt hits an overload, it will stun them. That's a good way to counter, but again, you're not going to be able to use Facet of Courage with that, so you change this out for something else. Or you could also change out Hellion and instead use Bleak Watcher, which you'll convert your grenade into a stasis turret. Stasis turrets slow, so those will also shoot and counter overload. Now, a smaller issue with this is that this turret could shoot other targets besides the overload. Generally, that's not a massive issue. And past those options, you could also change out your weapons. You could use a Void SMG like the Recluse, which will also allow you to counter barrier champions, and then you could use an exotic weapon for your heavy slot. Something like the Thunderlord will also counter overload champions, but you're not going to have near as much boss damage with that because you're not using Edge Transit. So I would generally recommend you change out your abilities, or you just hold Transcendence to counter those overloads. But that's the entirety of this build. I'm kind of surprised at how good this build actually is on Prismatic. It's ridiculously strong for all that high-end content. Gonna be very good if you're trying to jump into Grandmaster Nightfalls when those release, or doing any other content, all the way down to the easiest, all the way up to the hardest. So it met all of my criteria, and it's ridiculously strong, and it destroys bosses. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.
Enjoy having highly pressurized, supercharged radiolaria so near my hull. Please stop them, Captain.
The pressure is coming from underground. Its point of emergence should be detectable.